And specifically, it's not about creating brand new things, because pretty much, as the saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. So it's really about where things intersect, which is why I think the creative process is really about feeding your brain or your studio or the lives of your staff people or what have you with as much sometimes seemingly unrelated stimuli as possible, and coaching people up on the process of how to make connections. Because essentially, I believe that's what innovation is, and I think that's what creativity is. A unicorn that springs from the mind of a child is not something entirely new. It's a horse and a horn that they saw in a rhino or something and slapped on the horse's head, right? I mean, this wasn't something universally brand new. This was something that was a mashup. And most of the time, I think that's how innovation and creativity manifests itself, as a mashup. You were mentioning a writer gets up and reads. That's the first thing they do, right? They're feeding their mind. But this attempt to kind of codify it and turn it into this kind of process that starts with heuristic observation and moves into quantitative research that's then parsed and synthesized and put through this sausage machine, and something gets pooped out the other end, is, I think, a little misleading. So that's my little soapbox response to that. Personally, I have a fairly unique perspective in that I have 3 day jobs. So I run a design studio by day. I have co-founded a handful of software companies that I manage over my lunch break for the most part. And then I manage a handful of seed stage venture funds, one located here in Indianapolis called Gravity Ventures, and one that is located in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where I make my home half of the year. And so I have a kind of a different contrarian view of kind of how to feed innovation, specifically through the prism of design. And I think predominantly it's about exposure. I know in my studio we do a lot of field trips. We go to New York, we go to Austin, we go to Chicago, sometimes for legitimate purposes, i.e. things that we can write off, and other times just to go have dinner, right? So people can experience Nobu for the first time, since we haven't gotten one here in Indianapolis yet. And I think that is a critical component, especially if you're running a quote-unquote kind of creative business. In addition to funding your employees' 401ks and IRAs and continuing education, it is to expose them in the same way that a parent would expose children to architecture and art and fashion and things of that nature. Employers have to be extraordinarily intentional, I think, about creating those types of environments for the people that they work with.
What do you think, what does it add in terms of a creative process to the enterprise? Like, what do you see from your point of view that, those folks that are creative in your organization are contributing to the
I think that it gives people the tools to dream bigger dreams, which translates into better work kind of across the board. And sometimes it creates an environment where they dream such big dreams that they leave. One of my most trusted associates just moved to Portland because he wanted to live in Portland, right? Which is really cool, by the way, and he still works for us, and we think that's great. It really maps well to this conversation, right? Which is getting, this fixation on getting people to stay here. And Max touched on this, which is, hey, don't let the door hitch on the way out. Let them go. Let them breathe. Let them experience new things in the same way that a parent wants their, and I don't want to be pejorative. I'm not talking about staff people as children. That metaphor kind of breaks down at some point. But this fixation on stopping people from leaving is bonkers, right? Max also touched on this, which was we need to be focused on importation. And I don't want to digress too much there, but yeah, I think that kind of systemic exposure to new ideas just broadens the mind and allows them to dream bigger dreams and create better work.
So maybe I could ask Michael, in terms of importation and in terms of the type of communities that would attract, I'm assuming wanted to go to Portland maybe for many reasons, but also because of Portland.
Well, that's the only reason, right? He wanted to go to Portland because people like to ride bikes there. And they have more microbreweries per capita than any other city in America.
It's very
right?
important for the creative process.
You know, and that is, I mean, and this is the dirty little secret about all these conversations where we map culture to economic development. It's all about coolness. I mean, and that's, people don't want to talk about that because you can't quantify coolness. It doesn't sound very intellectual to talk about coolness. But that's really what we're talking about, is creating cool places. And not to get into kind of a Richard Floridian thing here, but that's what draws people to your community. And Portland has cracked that code in many ways.
So what do you think, Michael, about cool communities?
I think there is some of that there. I mean, you know, I always, I'm because I'm Canadian, I never like to take things too far. And so it's just in our nature. And so one of the things I caution there is that there's lots of different ways that communities can be attractive to people. And so, you know, we can know, you know, designers or artists and so on who say, I really want to be in Portland, I really want to be in New York City, and I teach lots of students who feel that way. But recognize that there's real variance across North America in terms of what kinds of cities attract people for what reasons. Microbreweries and interesting restaurants with lots of variety, that can be part of it. It can be sort of more traditional high arts institutions that attract some people, whereas it's more popular art and funkiness that attracts others. It can be recreational opportunities. I mean, there's lots of different ways that people sort themselves around here. And I caution cities when they say, this cool idea, because we know some people who are attracted by that, that's what we have to do. That's where we have to be, because it's not for everybody, and sometimes can even, the pursuit of that can almost alienate part of your own local population in terms of what they feel is important to them in a city.
In my opinion, I think that why people go to these places is because they're developed, and what I mean by urban, you know, when I said urban, they're developed urban spaces, and when I say urban, I mean shared spaces. That it may be a bit of a reaction toward the suburban model of living, of sort of being disconnected from the sense of community. So the sense of community, and I think you said that, Bich, is very important. So the fact that you are able to be connected with others, to possibly run into a friend at certain points, but you know, being able to bike and walk and have plazas and have civic spaces and these kind of things become very important for that community. Do you think that's the case, Bich?
I'd like to just jump in really quickly about Portland, because my brother lives in Portland, and he is a graphic designer, and he is extremely cool. He's very, very cool and very.
Of course he is.
Yes, of course. And he moved.
He's your brother.
Well, there you go. But he moved to Portland, 6 years ago, when it was really starting to develop the image it has. And whenever I visit him there, I realize one of the reasons why he is so happy there is because the arts they're not just supported there, they are assumed. There is just a sense that everybody is doing something creative. They're instead of having emphasis on sort of corporate big box stores, you have the opposite, which are these microbreweries and these little restaurants that are, homemade and sort of homegrown. And so that idea of innovation really comes from sort of a grassroots, kind of area that is part of the Portland ethos. Yeah. And that is what makes it cool. Coming from a university, Purdue, that focuses a little bit more on the arts, not on the arts rather than, but the sciences and engineering, students do not want to stay at Purdue. And part of the reason why is because it is not a cool town. It is not a cool town because the arts have been neglected. And even though there's a giant college of liberal arts there in which I teach, the budget's constantly being cut so that the budget of the sciences can be increased. And all of that is to the detriment, I think, of the university at large. There's no such thing as a really good Research One university that doesn't have a strong liberal arts program, and that is where the arts live, and that's where innovation really happens. So that is also the birthplace of cool, is in the arts.
I think it's interesting also to take Michael's point of view of the sort of definition of cool might be different for various people, and there may be multiple, but I think what's critical is to find what is that common ground of that cool.
Well, you got to stand for something, and to your point around common areas and community, I would argue, first of all, I stand by my cool statement. I think it's all about being cool, period, right? I think it's about a collective identity, though. So if you look at these cities that are often lauded as, prime examples of communities that got it, right? You look at Austin, Texas, and you look at Boulder, Colorado, and you look at Portland, Oregon. And to the kind of lesser degrees, communities like Boston and Atlanta in Northern California, they all have these very, very strong identities, right? So in Austin, it's all about keeping it weird, right? You know, that's the bumper stickers when you drive through, keep Austin weird, right? And Portland is all about kind of independence, right? And you're absolutely right. There's nothing big box about Portland. And Boulder is about the best of high-tech life coupled with pursuing the outdoors, you know? And it's all about these intersections, right? I forgot to mention cowboy boots when we talked about Austin. You look at a place like Indianapolis, and this is one of the things we struggle with, which is not infrastructure, it's not resources, it's this collective sense of identity that as a people that we don't really have. And the identity that we do have is kind of homogenized and prosaic, right? And as they were talking about at lunch, it's all about, it's a great place to raise a family, and it's got a low cost of living, and it's easy to get around, and all of these things that are kind of worthless when it comes to crafting an identity for a community, at least one that's not homogenized and not genericized. And that's really the struggle for a community like Indianapolis, which is what my friend Aaron Wren, who I know some of you guys know, says the only way Indianapolis can become a world-class city is by becoming a world-class Indianapolis. And that's about finding what is wonderful about this community from a kind of an indigenous perspective and building on that and importing on top of that.
Right. And that maybe bring us to the notion of strategy. You know, like what kind of strategies do we need to put together to get there, you know, in terms of that best Indianapolis possible? And, you know, the first question is sort of looking at current economic and cultural strategies. What's your opinion or what's your kind of advice in that? Any thoughts?
Okay, I'll give it a try here in terms of these strategies here, and I think what this whole talk is about is how developing innovation and so on and encouraging that. And this is it's an interesting topic. We in your opening remarks you talked about how we are now in an ideas economy. And one of the things I talk to my students about is that we've been in an ideas economy for a long time. The Industrial Revolution began the ideas economy.
Always. Yeah.
And economic growth since then has come from the development of new technology, new ideas, that's made us fantastically wealthy relative to what we had before, and has given us rates of economic growth that are terrific relative to the centuries and centuries that went before that. So growth comes from ideas, but that's been true for a very long time. I think what is new is that we're starting to think about what kinds of environments generate ideas, and what can we do that way? Because for the longest time, even economists, and I'm an economist, who studied economic growth simply kind of assumed that technological change, new ideas, simply happened. They fell as manna from heaven, and suddenly we have new technologies, let's use them. And only maybe, for the past 2 decades have people really started to think about, well, wait a minute, that's actually not what happens. People have to come up with new ideas. It comes up with, sort of human beings thinking about things, putting effort into it, and devising something new. And so that innovation policies really come around to saying, okay, how do we make sure that people have sort of the right incentives and the right environment to actually search out new ideas? That's what's really going to make the difference. And in fact, in teaching my students in our arts administration program at Indiana University, this is one of the things I try to talk to my students about,